it that in this war between Israel and Hamas, it isn't easy for the war to end when it could be ended just as quickly as one side surrendering. Again, I reiterate, because if Israel was to surrender, the Hamas would just, obliterate everybody in Israel, right? Kill everybody in Israel. That's their stated purpose. However, if the Hamas were to surrender, Israel has no intention of killing people just to kill people. Israel doesn't want to obliterate the Palestinian people. So there could be peace if the Hamas were to surrender, because then they could have talks, and proper talks post-war, and peace terms. But why doesn't that happen? Well, there are a lot of vested interests in containing and managing a long-term conflict. And what do I mean by that? As many of you who've been watching this channel know, a lot of it has to do with the vested interests of people who own shares in defense contracting companies. And what do I mean by that? Well, the companies that make the tanks and the bullets and the bombs and all those things are owned by a lot of people in politics. In the U.S., it's commonly known that people in Congress own shares in these companies. And in Israel, it's also known by people who bother to learn about this stuff that, like, all of the top cabinet ministers and all of the top generals who come back into public service through ministerial posts or whatever, between the time they left the army, sometimes even when they were in the army, and the time they take up government jobs, have already received shares in those kind of companies. And part of the problem that you have with that is that means that they have an interest in having the conflict last. And the same thing is true for the Palestinian leadership, many of whom own shares in concrete companies or cement companies. So when buildings in their territories get demolished, they make a lot of money by supplying fresh concrete, fresh cement for new construction. So they have vested interests through and through to keep this conflict going. And it's very unfortunate. It's highly unethical that anybody involved in a conflict should also own shares in the companies that provide the means to maintain and sustain that conflict for as long as it possibly can. That is one of the main reasons that these wars do not really end ever. At best, you have what they call a ceasefire, right? And that ceasefire just extends the conflict to a later date when it will no doubt start up again, right? Because that's what happens when you have warring parties who just agree to temporarily stop shooting at each other, right? It's kind of hard to negotiate peace when two sides sitting across the table from each other are not only just throwing things at each other on the battlefield or whatever, and sometimes even at the negotiation table, but more importantly, when they have a vested interest on both sides, and they both know it, to keep this going because it lines their pockets. And, citizens be damned, right? They don't really care what happens to the average population, because if they did, this kind of conflict would have ended a long, long time ago, right? When the Oslo Accords happened between the PLO and Israel, and the Palestinian Authority was established as a result of that, that didn't end the conflict. Why? Because, again, the same interested parties had an interest in keeping a low-temperature war continuing, and a long-term conflict continuing between the Arabs living in the West Bank and in Gaza and Israel, because of the same reasons I've just described. And the situation is no different today. The only tactical difference on the ground, or the only practical difference on the ground, is that now Israel has left, has first of all ceded a lot of control even in the West Bank, in different areas of the West Bank, to Palestinian Authority, autonomous governance. And you could say, well, it's not really autonomous because Israel controls the overall security. Yes, maybe, but they still, the Palestinians generally control their own security within their areas, and they even help the Israelis to combat terrorism. So, there has been some improvement in that sense, because the more reasonable Palestinians who are part of the Palestinian Authority, who have, in some way given up on their dreams of liberating Palestine from the river to the sea, which basically means to exterminate all the Jews in Israel, and to wipe out Israel off the map. Those Palestinians in the Palestinian Authority ostensibly, have stopped dreaming of doing that, and have accepted that there will be Israel here, and that they should find a way to live side by side in peace and coexistence, right? The problem is that on the other end, in Gaza, since the Israelis withdrew in 2005, there was an election in Gaza of the Palestinians, by the Palestinians, for the Palestinians, and whereas the Palestinian Authority was nominally in charge the moment Israel handed over the keys to Gaza in 2005, after Israel withdrew unilaterally without conditions, and said, here's your chance to prove to us that you want peace, and let's build a better future for you together. We'll help you, and you'll benefit from it. In 2006, immediately in the aftermath of the withdrawal, literally the very first thing that the Palestinians did, under the leadership of their Palestinian Authority, was to vent their joy and their anger at the same time, and they literally destroyed all of the things that the Israelis had built there between 1967 and 2005. They destroyed all the settlements, they destroyed all the greenhouses where there was literally food growing that they could have just harvested and used. They destroyed everything, and you can still see it today on Google Maps. Not a single thing has been rebuilt or built new in the places they destroyed. They just remain rubble. And why do they do that? They do that on purpose. They do that because, the leadership there, again, since 2006, has been Hamas, because Hamas won an election in 2006. They didn't win a majority. They only won the vote. And so the Palestinian Authority said, no, that's not enough. You have to have a majority of the vote. We don't count your election as a real victory. We have to have new elections or whatever. And of course, the Hamas rejected that, and they started a civil war between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And that civil war led, of course, to the horrific, murderous deaths of the Palestinian Authority forces, who were at the time in Gaza. And they were thrown off of buildings, they were shot, they were executed in all kinds of horrible ways you can imagine. And what that means is that they were left basically, out of power, and the Hamas was left in power. Right? They took over by force, brutal force, but they took over. And the net result is that since 2006, right, we see that the Hamas has basically maintained their warring stance. They haven't once, decided to say, okay, maybe we should change our ways. Maybe we should try to make peace since we now control this area. No, they've just used it as a reason to continue fighting against Israel. And thus Israel, of course, did blockade the waters off of Gaza, beyond 3 kilometers or 3 miles, whatever it is. And, made it more difficult for Palestinians to enter Israel. Although still a lot of Palestinians, until the war started here in October 7th of 2023, lots of Palestinians from Gaza were coming into Israel to work on a daily basis. And many of them, were going back and forth and making money and bringing it back into Hamas-led territory, right? But, again, it is in the interests of the people who lead Hamas to show that their people are suffering. It's not in the interest of the Palestinian people. Sadly, it's in the interest of the people in Hamas. And why? Well, because if they can show that the Palestinian people are suffering, then they can get the sympathy of world media and all kinds of people who kind of ostensibly pay attention to the situation. And what that leads to is just more ongoing conflict, because then the Hamas is able to garner support from Qatar and from international aid agencies like UNRWA and other groups around the world, the European Union, you name it. They receive quite a bit of money when you add it all up every year. Of course, their economy is, still paltry compared to that of Israel, but that's because the people in the Hamas leadership have been known to squirrel away that money and keep it for themselves. And not just the money, they also squirrel away the resources, right? Like when the EU, everybody knows by now, when the EU, went and installed sewage pipes and water pipes, the Hamas leadership decided, no, we're going to dig those things right up and turn them into rockets. And when they received fuel, they siphoned off a huge portion of the fuel to keep for the Hamas so that they could ventilate their tunnels underground, so that they could use the fuel for the rockets and for transportation and for communications and everything else for themselves and not for the people. Right? That's why the hospitals in Gaza right now are saying we don't have any fuel left. It's not true. They have tons of fuel. They have, reportedly 500,000 liters of fuel, which is not a small amount for when you have a couple million people, most of whom are not driving around in a normal kind of way that you have in typical society. So that's a large amount of fuel, certainly more than enough in the hospital to run their generators and keep, babies alive in incubators, etc., perform surgery on people, what have you. But again, the Hamas would rather show people suffering and dying because from their point of view, it's better propaganda, it's better media outreach, right? Better media relations to be able to get sympathy. But it's self-imposed damage, it's self-imposed harm. And the people in the media don't bother to point that out, usually. Some do, but most don't. The media, it's a very broad word. There's all kinds of media, pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, neutral, whatever. But generally speaking, if you look at the overall sentiment, you'll find over and over again that the media forces generally want to see this conflict go on because it's good for selling newspapers, it's good for clickbait, it's good for likes and subscribes or shares or whatever they are interested in getting these days. Right? It's good for selling advertisement because it's a lot easier to sell ads for conflict than practically anything else. Right? Selling ads around a conflict is one of the easiest things you can do in the newspaper business or the media business. And that's very obvious. And of course, many of the major sponsors of media are defense contractors and other companies that make money from defense contractors. So they're happy to fund, advertisements in media when really they would, the world would do better. But those media companies might suffer a little bit of a hit on the revenues in the short term if the headlines were to switch from, war to peace, right? The joy of peace is very effervescent. It is, or very ephemeral. It comes and goes very quickly. People celebrate it, and then the next day, people are like, "All right, it's over. Let's move on with our lives." And while the leaders, in theory, are negotiating real terms of peace, but that's not what we have, right? We have, again, vested interests who want to keep the conflict going, right? They would rather do that because they're making boatloads of cash whenever there's a flare-up. And again, the citizens are the ones who pay the ultimate price, right? Forgetting that we are all one world, one humanity. Not to sound like a hippy-dippy or a dippy-hippie, but we are one human race. And it is, the leaders of the groups that make the decision to send their children to fight and their young men and women to fight for whatever that is that they believe and what they want to achieve. And they don't really believe it necessarily. They just know that that's the easiest way to convince people to go and fight for what they say they believe, even if it isn't really belief. Which again comes down to, well, then how can we get one side to surrender? Well, it's not so easy, but it is certainly achievable. Obviously, Israel's attempt right now at making the Hamas, go away or be disarmed is, probably one way that could work, because historically that has worked. If you look at the Nazis being bombed to smithereens by the Allies, eventually the Nazis gave up. If you look at the Japanese having two of their major cities be completely obliterated and suffering, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of deaths because of nuclear bombs, the first two atomic bombs used in the world, the only two used in war by the Americans, the Japanese Empire surrendered, right? Their living God surrendered, right? And to them, it was no less of an ideological trip than the Hamas has, right? They were fighting literally for what they believed to be a living God. And the Nazis were fighting for what they believed to be, their right movement, their ideological right movement of, Aryan race taking over the world and dominating everyone and killing all the Jews and all the gays and all the gypsies and everyone that they considered, subhuman, physically handicapped people, mentally handicapped people, whatever. Anyone who wasn't quote unquote pure or Aryan would be slaughtered, right? Or turned into slaves and then slaughtered when they were no longer useful. So the same thing applies, right? You have one side that is on a, you could say suicidal or fundamentalist genocidal trip that they believe is their ultimate ideology. But that doesn't mean that it can't be changed. It doesn't mean that they can't let go of that ideology. Eventually, it might be the case that enough of them get blown away and that there's enough damage done to the Gaza Strip that the people of Gaza will just say, enough is enough. Let's end this nonsense once and for all and just surrender this stupid dream of obliterating the Jewish state, which will not go away. Because why should it? It's the only home in the world that is, a nation built by Jews for Jews. It's not a Jewish state in the sense of anyone can live in Israel if they're peaceful and they accept the laws, just like in any Western or industrialized nation. Of course, no Jews can live in the Palestinian occupied territories because the Palestinians won't allow Jews to live there, right? Nominally, they said no to that. So they have to get off of that ideological trip if they want a real peace to be achieved. And people who are standing up and saying, free Palestine and all that, what they're missing is that free Palestine in its current context means getting rid of Israel and killing all the Jews and everybody else who happens to be Israeli, right? That's what it means. I mean, point blank. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about some, mealy-mouthed, moderate position that's willing to compromise and willing to make accommodations for actual long-lasting peace. We're talking about extremists who are leading a crazy ideology of destruction, right? They've had since 2006 in Gaza. Since 2006, they've been completely in control of their own lives. Now you'll say, well, Israel can cut off the water and the electricity, so how can you say they're in control of their own lives? Well, again, they misused the funds that they received in Gaza to build war devices instead of to build, things that they need to establish a real little country by the seashore and to have what could frankly be a seaside paradise, right, of a couple million people. It could be a hotspot for tourism, could be a hotspot for technology, could be a hotspot for a lot of things. What do they choose to do? They choose to make war. And that is why we have this ongoing conflict. So again, until one side decides to surrender, this war will not end. And again, if it's the Israeli side that surrenders, all of Israel will be destroyed. Every Jew in Israel will be murdered. Every non-Jew who happens to be Israeli will be murdered. Right? They want to obliterate the Israeli country off the map entirely, including all of its citizens. But if the Hamas, and Israel does not have a declaration to destroy the Palestinian Arab Muslims or Arab Christians or anybody else, right? Israel has made it clear since its Declaration of Independence in 1948 that it wishes to exist side by side in peace and coexistence with its Arab neighbors, right? That's in the Declaration of Independence of Israel. What is in the covenant of the Hamas? Line 1. Right? Israel will exist until an Islamic force wipes it off of the face of the earth and kills every last Jew and Israeli citizen. That's line number 1, right, in their covenant. So it is up to them to change their psychopathic ways. It is up to them to decide that they actually want to achieve peace. And that means that it's really up to the Palestinian citizens or people since they're not officially a sovereign state. But it's up to the people of Gaza, who are controlled by Hamas, to say we've had it. And they could, yes, probably a bunch of Palestinians will die trying to fight against the Hamas, but they have to, at some point, say, we've had it with you guys. You've not been successful. You've just led us to more destruction, and it's your fault. And at some point, the Hamas will have to acknowledge that, either by force because they've been bombed out of existence by the Israelis, or because their own internal population will say, we've had it with you guys, enough. Revolutions do happen, right? So that is the long and short of it. And I hope that the end of this war happens sooner rather than later, and that the whole region and all people in it can have a more, happier, or a happy, peaceful, prosperous, and healthy, and long-lasting life and peace. Anyway, that's that for now. Talk to you guys later.